Marcus Reed, a former tech mogul, seeks to escape the pressures of corporate life by driving for a rideshare service. But one rainy night changes everything when a wealthy passenger falsely accuses him of theft. Suddenly, Marcus finds himself facing racial profiling, public humiliation, and a media firestorm that threatens to destroy his hard-earned reputation. Will Marcus clear his name and turn the tables on the system, or will the weight of prejudice be too much to overcome? To find out how this gripping story unfolds, make sure to comment below with your thoughts, subscribe for more powerful stories, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. The rain came down in a steady, rhythmic drizzle, coating the city in a shimmering layer of wetness. Streetlights reflected off the slick asphalt, turning the dark streets into a glossy mirror of glimmering yellows, reds, and blues. Inside a modest, nondescript sedan, Marcus Reed wiped a bead of condensation off the windshield with the back of his hand. The wipers moved methodically, their rhythmic swish the only noise breaking the quiet inside the car. It had been a long night, a typical one in some ways. Marcus had spent hours driving through the city, picking up strangers, listening to snippets of their conversations, and watching their lives unfold briefly before they vanished again. It was strange, really, the anonymity that came with driving for a rideshare service. In a world obsessed with sharing every moment online, it was one of the few places where people let their guards down, if only for a few minutes. No one ever looked at the driver. No one ever stopped to wonder who the man behind the wheel really was. That suited Marcus just fine. Leaning back slightly in his seat, he glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his own reflection. A clean-shaven black man in his late 30s, his dark eyes tired but alert. He had strong, sharp features, chiseled cheekbones, a square jaw, and a quiet intensity in his gaze that often made people assume he was someone important. And he was, at least in his past life. But the world behind these car windows didn't know that. To them, Marcus was just another driver, blending into the city's constant flow of workers and service providers. The rain picked up as Marcus adjusted the mirror again, this time catching sight of the distant skyscrapers. They rose up like monoliths, symbols of wealth and power that seemed far removed from the realities of the streets below. He sighed. There had been a time when those towers represented everything Marcus had worked for, everything he had once believed in. Marcus had grown up in a working-class neighborhood, where success meant escaping the grind, climbing the ladder, and proving you could rise above the circumstances you were born into. He'd done just that. By the time he was 32, Marcus had founded a tech company, built it from the ground up, and sold it for millions. He'd become one of the few black tech entrepreneurs to break into the upper echelons of the industry, rubbing shoulders with venture capitalists, tech titans, and high-powered CEOs. It was the kind of success people only dreamed about. But something had shifted. The more Marcus achieved, the more disconnected he felt from the world around him. The wealth, the power, the endless corporate dinners. It all started to feel hollow. The higher he climbed, the more he realized that no matter how much he accomplished, there were always unspoken barriers. The world saw him as successful, sure, but it also saw him as a black man first. And that label, despite all his achievements, came with its own set of assumptions. So he stepped away. It had been almost a year since Marcus left the corporate world behind. Some said it was a midlife crisis. Others assumed he had burned out. In reality, Marcus had just wanted to feel grounded again. He had wanted to remember what life was like outside of boardrooms and high-rise offices. Driving for a rideshare service wasn't about the money. He didn't need that. It was about something else, something deeper. Another night in paradise, Marcus muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. He reached for his phone, tapping the rideshare app. The familiar ping of a new fare lit up the screen. A pickup at one of the high-end hotels uptown. He sighed, knowing exactly what to expect from this ride. The people who ordered rides from places like that were predictable, wealthy, entitled, and often too busy with their own lives to acknowledge the man who was driving them. But business was business, and Marcus had chosen this path, at least for now. The rain fell harder as Marcus pulled away from the curb, navigating the maze of city streets. His hands gripped the wheel, eyes scanning the wet road ahead, the night stretching out before him like an endless ribbon of lights and rain. This was his routine now, quiet nights behind the wheel, ferrying people to and from their destinations, listening to fragments of their lives while keeping his own neatly tucked away. There was a strange peace in the monotony, a sense of detachment that allowed Marcus to step outside of himself for a while. The corporate world had been a different kind of grind, a relentless push for more. Driving was simpler, more immediate. There were no board meetings, no high-stakes negotiations, no endless metrics to analyze. It was just him, the car, and the city. As Marcus drove through the rain-slick streets, the city came alive in a way only it could at night. The neon lights of storefronts reflected off puddles, casting the sidewalks in a surreal glow. Pedestrians hurried along with their umbrellas, dodging the droplets that fell in an endless sheet from the sky. In the distance, the occasional blare of a car horn or the muted chatter of people drifting out of bars and restaurants filled the air. Marcus had already picked up a few passengers that night. Some were business professionals, still dressed in their office attire, heading home after long hours at their desks. One man in particular had stood out, a middle-aged executive who had spent the entire ride barking orders into his phone, his voice loud and authoritative, as if the car around him didn't exist. Marcus had driven in silence, his eyes focused on the road, tuning out the one-sided conversation happening in the back seat. It wasn't his business after all. Next came a group of college students, their laughter spilling into the car as they climbed in, wet from the rain but unbothered by it. They were loud, carefree, and filled with the kind of energy Marcus hadn't felt in years. They chattered about parties, exams, and weekend plans, seemingly oblivious to the fact that the man driving them was decades older and worlds apart from their carefree existence. By the time Marcus dropped them off, their fast food wrappers were left behind in the car, and they exited with barely a thank you. This was how most rides went. People came, people left, and Marcus remained the constant, a silent observer to the small slices of life that played out around him. He wasn't bothered by the lack of interaction. In fact, he preferred it that way. The fewer people noticed him, the better. That was the entire point of driving, to blend in, to be invisible for a while. As he drove, the cityscape shifted around him, moving from the older, grittier parts of town to the sleek, modern district where the high-rise buildings loomed large against the night sky. Here, the streets were quieter, more orderly. The people who lived in this part of the city were different, wealthier, more detached from the messiness of everyday life. Marcus had spent years working with these types of people, and he knew their world well. They weren't inherently bad, just out of touch. The ping of a new ride request snapped Marcus out of his thoughts. He glanced down at the app, noting the pickup location, the Grand Regent Hotel, one of the most luxurious spots in the city. The kind of place that catered to the rich, the powerful, and the elite. Marcus sighed, already imagining what kind of person would be waiting for him there. He could picture it perfectly as a high-powered executive, maybe a trust fund kid, or a wealthy socialite, dripping in designer clothes and an attitude to match. He had seen it all before, and tonight would be no different. As Marcus made his way toward the hotel, the rain came down harder, the sound of it pattering against the windshield in a steady rhythm. He glanced out at the city, the lights blurring as the water streamed down the glass. In the distance, the tall buildings of downtown loomed, their tops obscured by the low-hanging clouds. Marcus had spent years in those buildings, looking down at the world from above. Now, he was on the ground, moving through the city like everyone else. It felt both freeing and strange, like he was living someone else's life. He pulled up to the entrance of the Grand Regent Hotel, his headlights illuminating the pristine marble awning where a few valets stood, their umbrellas at the ready for incoming guests. The hotel itself was a marvel of modern design, all sleek lines and glass, towering over the street with an air of quiet opulence. Marcus idled the car, glancing up at the grand entrance. This part of town felt like another world. It was one of those places where everything gleamed, polished, perfected, untouchable. The guests who frequented the Grand Regent lived lives most people could only dream of. Marcus had once lived a life not far from theirs, though he had always felt like an outsider looking in, even at the height of his success. The passenger door swung open, pulling Marcus from his thoughts. A tall woman in a designer trench coat stepped in, her long legs crossing elegantly as she settled into the back seat. She didn't bother to close the door behind her, not that Marcus expected her to. People like her never did. Finally, the woman huffed as she slammed the door shut. Her phone was pressed tightly to her ear, and she barely spared Marcus a glance as she barked something into the receiver. "Yeah, I'm on my way now. Can you believe how long it took to get a car? Ridiculous." Marcus didn't say a word. He had seen her type before, wealthy, entitled, and too wrapped up in their own world to notice anyone else. She was tall, with sleek blonde hair pulled back into a ponytail, and she wore an expensive-looking coat that likely cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her high heels clicked against the floor of the car as she shifted in her seat, her fingers flying over her phone screen as she multitasked her way through whatever crisis was occupying her attention. Without looking up from her phone, she barked at an order. "Oak Street, and make it quick. I'm already late." Marcus nodded, though she wasn't paying attention to him. He merged back into traffic, the car slipping easily through the rain-slicked streets. Danielle Brooks was exactly the kind of passenger Marcus had expected to pick up from a place like the Grand Regent. Impatient, oblivious, and completely unaware of the man driving her. To her, Marcus was just another anonymous driver, someone who existed solely to get her from point A to point B. As Danielle continued her conversation, something about a gala, a new dress, and a client who was giving her trouble, Marcus tuned her out. He focused on the road, the rain coming down harder now, turning the city into a blur of colors and movement. He had gotten good at blocking out the noise, at letting passengers exist in their own worlds while he remained in his. It was easier that way. Safer. The ride continued in silence, at least on Marcus's end. Danielle, still glued to her phone, kept up her monologue about deals, dinners, and something about a custom handbag worth more than Marcus's car. He glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of her holding up the bag, a shiny, high-end designer piece that looked more like a status symbol than a practical accessory. Danielle barely looked up as the car rolled to a stop at a red light. She fumbled through the contents of her bag, pulling out a small mirror to reapply her lipstick. Her expression was one of indifference, as if this moment, this ride, was just another minor inconvenience in her perfectly curated life. Marcus tightened his grip on the wheel, resisting the urge to roll his eyes. He had driven countless people like Danielle, people who saw the world through a narrow lens, who believed that their wealth and status placed them above everyone else. He'd lived in that world once, too, attending the same parties, rubbing elbows with the same crowd. But there was always a price to pay for belonging, and Marcus had grown tired of the cost. The light turned green, and Marcus pressed the gas, navigating the quiet streets of the upscale neighborhood. Oak Street wasn't far now. He was ready to end the ride, to drop Danielle off and move on to the next fare. Maybe call it a night after this. The city had a way of wearing on you, especially when it seemed to be filled with people who didn't care to notice you were there. But as they neared the intersection, Danielle's voice sharpened, cutting through the low hum of the engine. "Wait, where's my bag?" she snapped, her eyes widening in panic as she frantically searched for the seat beside her. Her coat was tossed aside as she pawed through the back seat. Her breathing grew more erratic by the second. "My bag, it's gone!" she shrieked, her fingers trembling as she reached for her phone. Marcus felt the pit in his stomach drop. He knew what was coming next. He had seen it before. "I didn't touch your bag, ma'am," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady as he pulled the car to the side of the road. The rain continued to pour down, the steady patter of water against the windows, the only sound breaking the silence between them. "Maybe you left it at the hotel." Danielle's eyes flashed with anger, her face reddening as she whipped around to face him. "Don't you ma'am me," she hissed, her voice rising with accusation. "I know exactly what's going on here. You took it. You think I don't know how this works?" Marcus's grip tightened on the wheel, his knuckles turning white. He had been here before, accused of something he hadn't done, assumptions made about him based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the situation he found himself in. He forced himself to stay calm, to breathe through the anger bubbling up inside him. "I didn't take your bag," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "It's probably still at the hotel." Danielle wasn't listening. Her fingers were already flying across her phone screen, dialing the police. "I'm calling the police," she snapped, her voice trembling with rage. "You're not going anywhere until I get my bag back." Marcus felt a familiar dread settle over him, the weight of the situation pressing down like the heavy rain clouds above. He had done nothing wrong, but in moments like this, that didn't matter. It didn't matter who he was, what he had accomplished, or how calm he remained. In her eyes, he was guilty, and soon enough the police would be there to decide his fate. The sound of approaching sirens pierced through the night, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement. Marcus's night had just taken a turn for the worse. The wail of sirens pierced through the steady hum of rain, growing louder by the second. Marcus's heart raced as he watched the flashing lights of the police car reflect off the wet street, casting eerie streaks of red and blue across the rain-slicked asphalt. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to steady his breathing, but the familiar weight of dread settled over him like a lead blanket. This wasn't the first time Marcus had been in a situation like this, and deep down, he knew it likely wouldn't be the last. He had been careful all his life, navigating through a world that often assumed the worst about men like him, but no amount of caution could shield him from moments like this when the truth didn't matter and the assumptions of others could dictate the course of his night, and potentially his life. Beside him, Danielle Brooks was still frantically typing on her phone, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and panic. Her words from earlier rang in his ears. "You took it. You think I don't know how this works?" She hadn't even bothered to consider the possibility that she had simply left the bag behind. No, her mind had immediately jumped to the worst conclusion, the conclusion that Marcus was somehow responsible simply because he was the driver. The police car rolled to a stop behind Marcus's sedan, its headlights cutting through the rain. Two officers stepped out, their flashlights slicing through the mist as they approached the car. Marcus felt his chest tighten, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had learned long ago how to survive moments like this. Stay composed, don't argue, make every movement slow and deliberate. No matter how wrong the situation was, fighting back would only make things worse. One of the officers, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, approached Marcus's window and knocked. Marcus rolled it down slowly, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel, just as he had been taught. The rain splattered onto the window's edge, cold and relentless. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer said, his voice flat and professional. There was no room for negotiation in his tone, just the assumption that Marcus had already done something wrong. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Danielle's smug expression. She sat in the back seat, her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold as though she had already won. To her, the police were there to protect her, to side with her, and to punish Marcus for something he hadn't done. He sighed internally. He had seen this play out before, too many times. Slowly, Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out into the rain. The cold water immediately soaked through his jacket, clinging to his skin as he stood there, feeling exposed and vulnerable under the watchful eyes of the officers. "What seems to be the problem?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice calm despite the knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. Before the officer could answer, Danielle leaned out the back window, her voice cutting through the rain. "He stole my bag. It was right next to me, and now it's gone. I know he took it." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, willing himself to stay composed. He had to keep it together. He had to remind himself that reacting with anger would only confirm the assumptions these officers were already making. "I didn't take her bag," Marcus said evenly, his voice firm but controlled. "She must have left it at the hotel." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, a younger man who had been hanging back watching the scene unfold with a more neutral expression. The second officer stepped forward, his hand resting on the belt of his uniform as he addressed Marcus. "We're going to need to search the vehicle," the younger officer said, his tone more measured than his partner's. "Just to be sure." Marcus nodded. He knew this routine well. "Go ahead," he said, stepping back to allow them access to the car. He had nothing to hide, and he hoped that cooperating would make the situation end faster. As the officers began their search, Marcus stood in the rain, his jacket clinging to his body as the cold water soaked through. His mind raced with a mixture of frustration, anger, and a deep sense of exhaustion. How many times had he been reduced to this? Just another black man accused of something he didn't do, treated as guilty until proven innocent. He could hear Danielle in the back seat, muttering under her breath, still convinced that Marcus had stolen her bag. She wasn't watching the search with concern, though. She was certain the police would find something, anything to justify her accusation. The officers searched the car thoroughly, shining their flashlights under the seats, checking the trunk, and even looking through Marcus's glove compartment. Marcus watched, his stomach churning, even though he knew there was nothing to find. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the younger officer straightened up and turned to his partner. "There's nothing here," he said, his voice quiet. The older officer frowned, clearly displeased with the result. He glanced back at Danielle, who had rolled down her window just enough to make herself heard. Her face twisted with disbelief. "Of course there's nothing there," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "He must have hidden it somewhere, or thrown it out the window when he saw you coming." The officers exchanged a look, their expressions conflicted. Marcus could see that they weren't sure what to believe. The older officer seemed more inclined to trust Danielle's story, but the younger one looked more skeptical. Marcus could tell he was weighing his words carefully, unsure of how to proceed. Marcus took a deep breath, speaking up again. "She didn't have the bag when she got in the car," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I've been driving the whole time. She realized it was missing when we were almost here. It's probably still at the hotel." The younger officer seemed to consider this, but before he could respond, Danielle stepped out of the car, her face flushed with anger. She stood in the rain, her designer coat gleaming under the streetlights, and pointed accusingly at Marcus. "I don't care what you say," she snapped. "He took it. I want him arrested." Marcus's heart sank at her words. He had done everything right. He had cooperated, stayed calm, and followed the officer's instructions. But none of it mattered. In her eyes, in the eyes of people like her, he was already guilty. And in this moment, it felt like there was nothing he could do to change that. The older officer nodded slowly, as if coming to a reluctant decision. He turned to Marcus, his hand hovering near his cuffs. "We're going to have to take you in, at least until we can figure out what's going on." Marcus felt the weight of those words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been careful. He had done everything by the book. But none of it mattered. The system wasn't designed to protect him, and deep down, Marcus had always known that. The handcuffs were cold and heavy as they clicked around Marcus's wrists. He stood there drenched and defeated as the officers led him to the back of the squad car. The rain poured down harder, the night growing darker, as Marcus watched the city blur by through the window. He had been here before, too many times, and it never got easier. The station was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the small holding cell where Marcus now sat. His hands, sore from the cuffs, rested in his lap as he leaned back against the hard metal bench. The walls seemed to close in around him, their bare concrete surfaces amplifying the sound of distant footsteps and the occasional muffled conversation. Marcus had been in this kind of situation before, but that didn't make it any easier. The sting of injustice still burned deep in his chest, a familiar ache that he had spent years trying to numb. He had done everything right, yet here he was, booked, fingerprinted, and treated like a criminal for something he hadn't done. The officers had been efficient in their processing. After the initial questioning, Marcus had been escorted into the station, where they took his fingerprints and filed the necessary paperwork. It was all routine, just another day in the system. But for Marcus, it was a reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control, how easily his life could be reduced to a series of assumptions and accusations. He closed his eyes, the harsh light of the station seeping through his eyelids. His mind wandered, drifting back to the life he had left behind, the life of boardrooms, venture capital meetings, and high-powered negotiations. The life where he had built a multi-million-dollar tech company from the ground up, defying the odds as a black man in an industry that wasn't designed for him to succeed. Marcus had always known that his success came with certain expectations. He had been the face of a thriving business, a poster child for the kind of diversity the tech world liked to tout when it was convenient. But even in those spaces, he had never fully escaped the weight of the assumptions people made about him. He had been the only black man in too many rooms, and the pressure to prove himself, to be perfect, had always lingered just beneath the surface. Leaving that world behind had been a way to escape, to reclaim some part of himself that had been lost in the endless pursuit of success. But now, sitting in this holding cell, Marcus realizes that no amount of success could protect him from moments like this. No matter how high he climbed, he would always be vulnerable to the same old prejudices. A loud clang jolted Marcus from his thoughts. The door to the holding cell swung open, and a guard stepped in, his expression neutral. "You've got a visitor," the guard said, motioning for Marcus to follow him. Marcus stood up, his muscles stiff from sitting on the cold bench. He wasn't sure who would be visiting him at this hour, but a small flicker of hope sparked in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this. The guard led Marcus down a dimly lit hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. They passed a few other holding cells, each one occupied by men who sat in silence, their heads down, their expressions blank. Marcus felt a pang of sympathy for them, knowing that their stories were likely not too different from his own. Finally, they reached a small room with a single table and 2 chairs. Sitting at the table was a familiar face, Daniel Harris, Marcus's best friend and lawyer. Daniel was dressed sharply, as always, his dark suit immaculate despite the late hour. His expression was a mix of concern and barely contained anger, the kind of anger that Marcus knew all too well. "They really screwed up this time," Daniel said, standing up as Marcus entered the room. His voice was low and tense, the words laced with frustration. "Don't worry, Marcus. I'm handling it." Marcus nodded, grateful, but still feeling the weight of the night pressing down on him. He knew that Daniel was one of the best lawyers in the city, and if anyone could get him out of this mess, it was him. But that didn't change the fact that Marcus was tired of fighting the same battles over and over again, tired of being seen as guilty before anyone even knew his story. "Thanks for coming," Marcus said, his voice quiet as he sat down across from Daniel. "I knew this was going to blow up, but I didn't think it would happen like this." Daniel leaned in, his expression serious. "You did everything right, Marcus. This isn't your fault, but we need to move fast. The media is already picking up the story." Marcus groaned inwardly. Of course, the media would be all over this. A black man falsely accused of theft, handcuffed and arrested. It was exactly the kind of story that would ignite a firestorm of controversy. And in the age of social media, stories like this spread like wildfire. "We need to control the narrative before it gets any worse," Daniel continued, his tone urgent. "I've already got my team on it, but you need to prepare yourself. This is going to be public, and it's going to get messy." Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. He had known this was coming, but hearing Daniel lay it out so plainly made it all feel more real. He had tried so hard to keep his life private, to separate his personal identity from the public persona he had built as a successful businessman, but now it seemed that everything was about to come crashing down. "Do we have a chance?" Marcus asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Can we turn this around?" Daniel's eyes softened, and he nodded. "We're going to do more than turn it around. We're going to make sure the world knows the truth. This isn't just about clearing your name, Marcus. This is about something much bigger." Marcus looked across the table at Daniel, his friend's confidence a small source of relief in the whirlwind of everything that had happened. He nodded, though the knot in his stomach refused to loosen. "I know you've got my back," Marcus said, his voice low. "But this whole thing, it's not just about me. It's about all of us." Daniel's eyes softened even further, and Marcus knew that he understood. They had both grown up seeing injustice, watching friends and family members be treated unfairly by a system that wasn't built to protect them. Daniel had become a lawyer to fight that system, while Marcus had turned to business, creating his own empire in the tech world. But now, here they were, back at square one, battling the same prejudices that had haunted them their entire lives. "I've already got the media on this," Daniel said, leaning back in his chair. "They're going to break the story soon. We need to control the narrative before it spirals out of control." Marcus nodded, though the weight of the situation still sat heavily on his shoulders. He knew Daniel was right. They had the resources to fight this. But deep down, it wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about the fact that even with everything he had accomplished, he was still vulnerable to the same old assumptions. The thought made Marcus feel exhausted, more than he had in a long time. But he knew he couldn't give up. Not now. Not after everything he had been through. As they left the room and headed back toward the front of the station, Marcus's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his name being called. He turned to see a small crowd of reporters gathering outside, cameras flashing through the glass doors. His stomach dropped. "They're already here," Daniel muttered, his face set in determination. "We've got this, Marcus. Just stick to the facts and let me do the talking." Marcus nodded, but the pit in his stomach only grew deeper. He had done everything right, yet here he was, at the center of a media storm, about to be judged by the world for something he didn't do. The doors swung open, and the flash of cameras blinded him as they stepped outside. The reporters' voices were a blur, their questions overlapping in a chaotic frenzy. "Mr. Reed, is it true you were arrested for theft? How do you respond to the allegations? Why were you driving for a ride-share service in the first place?" Marcus kept his head down, following Daniel's lead as they pushed through the crowd. The flashing cameras and shouting voices faded into the background as Marcus tried to focus on what was ahead. This was just the beginning, and the road ahead was going to be long. The flashing cameras and shouting voices followed Marcus like a storm, the chaos of the reporters blending into a buzzing hum that rang in his ears. The walk from the police station to Daniel's car felt longer than it should have, with each step weighed down by the gravity of what had just unfolded. By the time Marcus slid into the passenger seat and closed the door, his mind was spinning. Daniel turned the key in the ignition, his jaw set in grim determination as he navigated through the rain-soaked streets. The rain had picked up again, the drops streaking across the windshield in heavy, uneven lines. But Marcus hardly noticed. His thoughts were consumed by the events of the last few hours, the accusation, the arrest, the cameras. It had all happened so fast, and now the world was watching. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but Marcus ignored it. He already knew what was waiting for him on the other end. Dozens of texts, missed calls, and notifications from people who had seen the headlines, wondering how it had all come to this. He wasn't ready to face that yet. "They're going to tear this story apart," Daniel said, breaking the silence in the car. His voice was calm, but Marcus could hear the edge of frustration beneath it. "I've already seen a few of the initial articles. The media's framing this exactly how we thought they would." Marcus sighed, staring out the window as the city lights blurred together in the rain. "Let me guess. Billionaire tech founder accused of theft while driving Uber?" Daniel nodded, his knuckles tightening around the steering wheel. "Exactly. They're playing up the shock factor. They don't care about the truth right now. They just want the clicks. That's why we need to get ahead of this, Marcus. If we don't, they'll write the narrative for us." Marcus rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle in. He knew Daniel was right. The media loved stories like this, stories that humanized the wealthy by dragging them through the mud. They wanted to paint Marcus as the fallen star, the tech mogul who had somehow spiraled from boardrooms to police custody. And even worse, they wanted to turn the narrative into something about race, wealth, and assumptions because that's what sold. "How bad is it?" Marcus asked, finally pulling out his phone. He braced himself as he unlocked the screen and scrolled through the barrage of notifications. "Bad," Daniel said with a grim sigh. "Social media is blowing up. People are either defending you or tearing you apart. Some are calling it racial profiling, while others are using it to say you're out of touch, asking why a billionaire was driving Uber in the first place." Marcus scanned the headlines. Daniel wasn't exaggerating. Every major news outlet had picked up the story, with variations on the same headline splashed across websites, social media, and news feeds. "Billionaire tech founder arrested for theft." Marcus Reed, Uber driver, former CEO arrested after passenger accuses him of stealing designer bag. Tech mogul Marcus Reed detained by police. What really happened? Some articles were worse than others, painting the story as a fall from grace for a man who once had it all. Others hinted at deeper issues, racial profiling, injustice, and the fragile nature of success when you're black in America. And then there were social media threads, which ranged from supportive messages of outrage to outright vitriol. Marcus scrolled through the comments, his heart sinking as he read some of the responses. "I don't care how rich you are. If you're driving Uber, something's wrong. He stole that bag for sure. You think a guy like that doesn't need the money? What a joke. This is clearly racial profiling. That woman accused him because he's black, plain and simple. Why was a billionaire driving Uber in the first place? Seems like he was looking for trouble. He set his phone down, unable to read anymore. It was too much, too fast. How had everything unraveled so quickly? He had spent years building his career, his reputation, and his life. And in one night, a false accusation threatened to destroy all of it. "What do we do now?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice filled with the kind of exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. It was soul-deep weariness, the kind that came from fighting the same battles over and over again. Daniel glanced at him, his expression softening. "We fight back. We tell the truth. You did nothing wrong, Marcus, and we're going to make sure everyone knows that. But it's going to take time, and it's going to get messy before it gets better." Marcus nodded, though the weight of it all still pressed down on him. He knew Daniel was right. They could fight this, but the damage was already done. Even if they cleared his name, even if the truth came out, there would always be people who believed the worst, people who would see him not as Marcus Reed, the successful tech entrepreneur, but as Marcus Reed, the black man accused of theft. It was a harsh reality, one he had lived his entire life. By the next morning, the media storm had reached a fever pitch. Marcus woke up to find his face plastered across every news outlet, his name trending on social media. The headlines hadn't changed much overnight, but the story had only grown bigger, with new details emerging as more people weighed in. He sat at his kitchen table, a half-empty cup of coffee in front of him, as he scrolled through the news on his phone. The articles all blurred together, but one thing was clear. His life was no longer private. His secret driving for a ride-share service was now public knowledge, and the world was obsessed with figuring out why a man like him had chosen to step away from the high-powered world of tech to do something so seemingly ordinary. It was strange. The ride-sharing had never been about money or fame. It had been about reconnecting with the world, stepping away from the corporate machine, and reminding himself of the life he had once lived. But now his quiet, personal choice had become a media spectacle, and everyone had an opinion about it. The phone buzzed, and Marcus saw his mother's name flash across the screen. He hesitated before answering, knowing exactly what the conversation would be. "Marcus," her voice came through, tight with concern. "What's going on? I saw the news. I've been trying to get a hold of you." "I know, Mom," Marcus said, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I'm sorry. I've just been dealing with everything. I don't understand. How could this happen?" Her voice wavered with worry. "Why were you driving for Uber? Why didn't you tell me?" Marcus sighed. His mother had always been supportive of his choices, but this was different. This was something she couldn't understand. "It wasn't a big deal, Mom. I just wanted to step away from everything for a while. Driving helped me clear my head, you know. It wasn't supposed to turn into this." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, filled with that maternal worry that Marcus had grown up with. "I just don't want to see you get hurt, Marcus. You worked so hard to build your life, and now everyone's talking about you like you're some kind of criminal." Marcus's chest tightened. He had always been his mother's pride, the son who had defied the odds and achieved success beyond their wildest dreams. And now he could hear the fear in her voice, the fear that all of it could be taken away in an instant. "I know, Mom," he said quietly. "I know." When the call ended, Marcus sat in silence, staring at the cold cup of coffee in front of him. The weight of everything, the media frenzy, the accusations, the fear in his mother's voice, it all pressed down on him like a heavy fog. But before he could spiral further, his phone buzzed again. This time it was Daniel. "We need to make a move," Daniel said without preamble. "I've got a press conference lined up for later today. We need to get ahead of this before it spirals out of control." Marcus's stomach clenched. The idea of standing in front of the cameras, facing the barrage of questions from the media, made his skin crawl, but he knew Daniel was right. They couldn't stay silent any longer. If they didn't control the narrative, someone else would. "Do I really have to do this?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes," Daniel replied firmly. "You do. This is your chance to set the record straight. Tell them the truth. Tell them what really happened." Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had given speeches before, countless ones in fact. But this felt different. This wasn't about business or innovation. This was about his life, his identity, and the assumptions people had made about him. "I'll be there," Marcus said finally, the words feeling heavier than he expected. "Good," Daniel said, his tone softening. "We'll get through this, Marcus. Trust me." Marcus hung up the phone, his hands shaking slightly as he placed it on the table. The truth was, he wasn't sure if he could trust anyone right now, not even himself. But one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. The conference room was packed. Reporters filled every corner of the space. Cameras lined the back wall, their lenses trained on the podium where Marcus would soon stand. The air buzzed with anticipation, murmured conversations blending into a low hum of noise as the journalists prepared for what they expected to be a headline-grabbing spectacle. Marcus stood just outside the door, his heart pounding in his chest. His hands felt clammy, and despite the cool air in the room, sweat trickled down the back of his neck. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, at least not like this. In the past, he had been in control of the narrative. As a CEO, he had presented carefully curated stories to the media, highlighting his company's successes, his latest innovations. But this time, the story wasn't about business. It was about him, his personal life, his choices, and the assumptions people had made based on nothing more than a fleeting accusation. Daniel stood beside him, offering a firm pat on the back. "You've got this, Marcus. Just speak your truth. Let them know what really happened." Marcus nodded, though the knot in his stomach refused to loosen. He had spent the entire drive over here rehearsing what he was going to say, but now, with the cameras waiting on the other side of the door, everything felt jumbled, disjointed. His mind raced with thoughts of what could go wrong, how the media would twist his words, how the public would react. But there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, Marcus stepped into the room. The noise of the crowd quieted instantly as all eyes turned toward him. The flashing lights of the cameras momentarily blinded him, but he pushed through, making his way to the podium, gripping the edges for support as he took his place before the sea of reporters. For a moment, Marcus just stood there, looking out at the faces in front of him. Some were curious, some skeptical, others eager to capture the next big soundbite. But all of them were waiting for him to explain himself. He cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the tremor of emotion that swirled just beneath the surface. "I'm here today to tell you the truth." The room remained silent, the air thick with anticipation. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but he pushed forward, finding his voice as the words began to flow. "Many of you know me as the founder of a tech company," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. "Some of you know me as a businessman and entrepreneur, but last night none of that mattered. None of it protected me from the assumptions that were made." He paused, letting his words sink in, the weight of the moment settling over the room. "Last night I was accused of theft, not because there was any evidence, but because of assumptions. Assumptions that people make based on how I look, based on the color of my skin." He could see the reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks, their cameras clicking as they captured every word, every movement. "This isn't just about me," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "This is about all of us. It's about the people who face these assumptions every single day, who are judged not by their actions but by the way they look. The room remained silent, the tension palpable as Marcus continued. I didn't ask for this attention. I didn't want to be the center of this kind of story. But now that I am, I'm going to use this moment to speak out. Not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been in my position and didn't have the chance to be heard. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Marcus could see the impact they were having, the realization dawning on the faces of those in the room. This wasn't just a story about a billionaire and a missing handbag. This was a story about systemic injustice, about the prejudices that lurked beneath the surface of everyday life. As Marcus stepped back from the podium, his heart raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The room remained silent for a moment longer, and then slowly, applause began to build. It started small, but soon it swelled into a wave of support, the sound filling the room. Marcus nodded, stepping down from the stage as Daniel met him with a smile. You did good, Daniel said, clapping him on the shoulder. Marcus exhaled, a mix of relief and exhaustion washing over him. He had said what needed to be said, but he knew the fight wasn't over. The media would still run with the story. People would still make their judgments, but at least now the truth is out there. As Marcus and Daniel left the conference room, the energy from the room lingered with them. The impact of Marcus's words reverberated not just in the minds of the reporters, but in the millions who would soon be watching and reading about it. Marcus could feel weight lifting, even if only slightly, but he knew this was only the beginning. The night after the press conference, Marcus lay awake in bed, his mind racing with the whirlwind of the past few days. The applause had felt good, necessary even, but it hadn't erased the knot of tension in his stomach. His words had resonated with the room, and the media response had been largely supportive, but Marcus knew how quickly things could change. The world was fickle, and public opinion could shift at the drop of a headline. For now, though, there was a window of opportunity. Marcus had become more than just a news story. He was a symbol, a voice for people who had long been silenced. But what was he supposed to do with that? How did he take this moment and turn it into something meaningful, something lasting? His phone buzzed on the bedside table, lighting up with a message from Daniel. Daniel, got a call from some people at City Hall. They're talking about making policy changes regarding racial profiling. You need to be at this meeting tomorrow. We've got a shot to make real change. Marcus stared at the screen, his heart racing. This was it, the next step. He hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly, but the press conference had struck a nerve. People were paying attention, and the narrative was starting to shift. But the pressure to keep the momentum going felt overwhelming. He tossed and turned, trying to quiet his thoughts, but sleep remained elusive. His mind kept replaying the events of the past few days, the accusation, the arrest, the press conference. And beyond that, the years of unspoken prejudices, and the countless moments where he'd been reduced to a stereotype, judged before anyone even knew his name. The world had changed since he was a kid, but not enough. And now, for the first time, he had the platform to push for something bigger. He couldn't waste it. The next morning, Marcus was still exhausted, but there was no time to dwell on it. Daniel had set up the meeting with several key city officials, and it was crucial for Marcus to make a strong impression. The conversation wouldn't just be about his experience, it would be about the systemic injustices that had affected so many others who didn't have the resources to fight back. When Marcus arrived at City Hall, he found Daniel waiting for him outside. As always, Daniel looked sharp in his tailored suit, his expression a mix of confidence and urgency. "They're ready for you," Daniel said, his eyes scanning Marcus's face. "You good?" Marcus took a deep breath and nodded. "Yeah, let's do this." Inside, they were greeted by a small group of city officials. including a council member who had been particularly vocal about addressing racial profiling in law enforcement. The room was formal, but there was a sense of anticipation hanging in the air. The officials wanted change. They just needed someone to help them figure out what that change should look like. For the next hour, Marcus spoke candidly about his experience, about how one false accusation had nearly derailed his life, despite his wealth and status. He talked about the larger issue of racial profiling, the assumptions that were made about black men in particular, and how those assumptions could lead to life-altering consequences. "This isn't just about one night," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "It's about the way the system is set up to treat people like me as guilty until proven innocent. I was lucky I had the resources to fight back, but there are so many people who don't." The officials listened intently, nodding in agreement as Marcus spoke. Daniel chimed in with legal suggestions, proposing new policies and training programs that could help prevent these kinds of incidents from happening in the future. By the time the meeting ended, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The officials had agreed to draft a proposal for policy changes that would address racial profiling in the city's law enforcement practices, and they wanted Marcus to be involved in the process moving forward. As they left City Hall, Daniel clapped Marcus on the back, a rare grin on his face. "You did it, man. This is going to be big." Marcus smiled, though the weight of responsibility still pressed down on him. "It's a start," he said, "but there's a long way to go." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, but you've got momentum now. People are listening. You can make a real difference." Marcus knew Daniel was right. The press conference had been the beginning, but this meeting had taken things to another level. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about using his platform to create real, lasting change. But as the adrenaline of the day began to fade, Marcus couldn't help but feel the exhaustion creep back in. The fight was far from over, and the road ahead was uncertain. While Marcus was beginning to make strides toward policy change, the fallout for Danielle Brooks had been swift and severe. Her name had been dragged through the media following the press conference, and investigative journalists had uncovered several unsavory details about her past. It turned out that Danielle wasn't the first person she had falsely accused of something. There were whispers of previous incidents, similar stories where Danielle had leveraged her privilege and status to cast blame on others, particularly people of color. Those stories had been buried at the time, but now, with the media's focus on her, they were resurfacing, and her reputation was crumbling. It didn't help that social media had latched onto the narrative of a wealthy white woman falsely accusing a black man. The public was outraged, and Danielle quickly became a symbol of entitlement and racial injustice. Her face was plastered across tabloids and news channels, but this time, it wasn't in a flattering light. The last Marcus had heard, Danielle had been forced to step down from several charitable boards she was involved in, and her social media presence had all but disappeared. It seemed she was retreating from public life, though Marcus doubted she would disappear completely. People like Danielle always had a way of bouncing back, but he didn't care. He wasn't interested in her downfall. All he wanted was for the truth to come out, and it had. Her public shaming was an inevitable consequence of her actions, but Marcus wasn't vindictive. He didn't want to destroy her. He just wanted justice. Still, a part of him couldn't help but feel a grim sense of satisfaction, knowing that she would have to live with the consequences of her actions. For once, someone like Danielle had been held accountable. A few days after the City Hall meeting, Marcus was in his office when his assistant knocked lightly on the door. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her voice hesitant. "It's Danielle Brooks." Marcus's eyebrows shot up in surprise. He hadn't expected to hear from Danielle again, let alone see her in person. He debated for a moment, unsure if he wanted to face her after everything that had happened. But then curiosity got the better of him. "Send her in," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. A few moments later, Danielle stepped into the room, her posture stiff and uncomfortable. She looked different, more subdued, more vulnerable. Gone was the confident, entitled woman who had accused him of theft. In her place stood someone who looked defeated, her eyes downcast as she approached his desk. "Mr. Reed," Danielle began, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to apologize." Marcus studied her for a moment, his face unreadable. He had imagined this moment many times, but now that it was here, he didn't feel the sense of triumph he thought he might. "You don't owe me an apology," Marcus said, his tone measured. "You owe an apology to everyone who has ever been in my position. People you judged before you even knew them." Danielle swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the floor. "I didn't know," she murmured. "I didn't realize what I was doing. I just assumed." "And that's the problem," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm but calm. "You assumed. You didn't see me as a person. You saw me as someone who fit the narrative you already had in your head." Tears welled in Danielle's eyes, and she nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "I know I was wrong. I realize that now. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted to tell you how sorry I am." Marcus leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. He wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Tired of the assumptions, tired of the expectations, tired of being reduced to a stereotype. "I'm not the one you need to ask forgiveness from," Marcus said quietly. "You need to figure out how to make this right with yourself. This isn't about me anymore. It's about what you're going to do with this moment." Danielle nodded again, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She wasn't used to being held accountable, and it showed. But Marcus didn't feel sorry for her. He hoped she would take this moment and learn from it, but he also knew that people like Danielle didn't change overnight. As she left his office, her head bowed, Marcus watched her go, unsure if she had truly learned anything. But at least she had come. That in itself was a small step forward. In the weeks that followed, Marcus found himself grappling with a decision. His story had sparked widespread conversations about racial profiling, privilege, and the assumptions people made based on appearance. The momentum was still strong, and more people were reaching out to him, asking him to speak at events, participate in panels, and even lead discussions on racial justice. But Marcus wasn't sure if he was ready for all of it. He had stepped away from the corporate world to find peace, to reconnect with something simpler. Now, it seemed like his life was more complicated than ever. Could he balance his desire for a quiet life with this newfound role as an advocate for change? Did he even want to? One evening, as Marcus sat on the balcony of his penthouse, looking out over the city, he thought about everything that had happened. The city had always felt like a living, breathing entity, pulsing with energy, vibrant and chaotic, but tonight it felt different, quieter maybe, or maybe it was just him. His phone buzzed beside him, and he glanced down to see another text from Daniel. "Daniel, the media is still on your side. People want to hear more from you. We should set up a series of interviews." Marcus sighed, his thumb hovering over the screen. He had known this day would come, but he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. Part of him wanted to step back, to let the public conversation continue without him. But another part of him knew that he couldn't just walk away. He had a platform now, a responsibility to use it. With a deep breath, Marcus typed a response. "Marcus, let's do it." Several months later, Marcus stood on the stage of a packed auditorium, the bright lights illuminating the sea of faces before him. The room was filled with people from all walks of life, activists, students, business leaders, community organizers. They were all there to hear him speak, to listen to his story and the lessons he had learned along the way. Marcus gripped the edges of the podium, his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and excitement. This wasn't where he had expected to be, but now that he was here, it felt right. Taking a deep breath, Marcus began to speak. "Many of you know my story," he said, his voice steady and clear. "But this isn't just about me. This is about all of us." The room was silent as Marcus continued, his words carrying the weight of experience, the weight of truth. He talked about the assumptions people made, about the way the system was designed to judge people before they even had a chance to prove themselves. He spoke about the importance of pushing for change, of using your voice, no matter how small, to challenge the status quo. "This isn't just my fight," Marcus said, his voice rising with conviction. "This is a fight for everyone who has ever been judged unfairly, for everyone who has ever been reduced to a stereotype. We can't let these assumptions define us. We have to stand up and demand something better." The applause was immediate, the sound swelling as the crowd rose to their feet, their support filling the room. Marcus stood there taking it all in, a sense of peace settling over him. This was where he was meant to be, fighting not just for himself but for everyone who had been silenced, overlooked, or misunderstood. As he stepped away from the podium, Daniel met him with a proud smile, clapping him on the back. "You did it," Daniel said. "You're making a difference." Marcus nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "We're just getting started." The fight wasn't over. Marcus knew that. But tonight, as he looked out at the crowd, he felt something shift. The weight he had been carrying for so long felt lighter, and for the first time in a while, Marcus felt hopeful. This was just the beginning of something bigger. And now, more than ever, he was ready to keep pushing forward, not just for himself, but for everyone who deserved to be seen for who they really were. As the lights dim and the story of Behind the Wheel draws to a close, we hope you felt the emotional weight of Marcus Reed's journey and the fight for justice, truth, and change. If you enjoy this story and want to see more powerful narratives, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Let's keep the conversation going. Together, we can push for change. Thank you for watching.